So let's open our Bibles tonight. We're going to start in the book of John, chapter 9. And we've been doing a series of studies out of the various places in the scriptures about Bible characters that can teach us a lot about our character and our walk with the Lord. And so this evening we wanted to turn to John 9. There's just really one story there. In fact, the entire lesson is compacted into one chapter. The miracle is there. In fact, this is a healing of a man who was born blind, and I believe, I couldn't find another, that this is the only mention of a man born blind that the Lord gives sight to. I know that he gives sight to the blind, but this is unique, at least in the way that it is presented to us. It is also only one of 7 miracles that John has chosen to highlight in his book that Jesus is God. In fact, when you get towards the end of this book, John chapter 20, John kind of winds things down. He says, truly Jesus did more signs in the presence of his disciples than are written in this book. In fact, there wouldn't be enough books to contain them. But he said, these were written, these 7 in particular, that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might then find life in his name. And so this is one of those 7 that we're going to look at this evening. And the whole story, like I said, is here. The suffering of the gentleman, the miracle, the reaction from his family, from the religious leaders who are really enemies of Jesus, the young man himself, and then finally the spiritual application that Jesus gives to the whole event. So let's start there in chapter 9, verse 1. Also, when we're done, we're going to have communion tonight. So I don't think I mentioned to you when we started, but just to remind you, make sure you have your communion elements ready there in your house with your family. If you don't have them ready, I'll wait. Okay, this is as long as I'm waiting, but you can get them while we're going, okay? And let's have communion together as well. Well, here's what verse 1 says in chapter 9 of John. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was born blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, and they said, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents have sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. Now, in the context, go back to verse 1, as Jesus was passing by, you might go back and read just the last 10 or 11 verses of the previous chapter, because in context, Jesus was really arriving here in this Jericho area from a murder attempt. In fact, if you look at verse 59 of the previous chapter, all you read there is they took up stones to stone him or to throw at him, but Jesus had to hide himself. He went out of the temple area and passed through the midst of them, and then he went his way. So there in the Jerusalem area, I said Jericho, I think I'm looking at the wrong word here, but Jesus was up in the temple area, and he just barely escaped a murder plot. He was their target audience, if you will. And so as they were passing by, as they were getting out of that area, as the disciples and Jesus were moving along, they encountered this man that was blind from birth. Luke tells us specifically that he was blind from birth. The disciples asking Jesus a question presupposes, as they asked, that every disability in life, every difficulty in life was a direct result of someone's specific sin. I don't know that they knew initially that he was born blind, or I think the question might have been immediately about his parents. But early on, apparently they didn't know. They might have talked to him obviously later. But the question becomes, all right, if it isn't him because he was born that way, is it his parents' fault? Now, there are a lot of folks that have gone back to Exodus chapter 20, for example, in trying to tie specific sins to specific suffering. And they will quote there that the Lord had said that he would visit the sins of the fathers on the 3rd or the 4th generations on those who hate God. They usually leave out the next verse, which says that the Lord would also show mercy to the thousands who love me and keep my commandments. But there's always this case that they, I guess, try to make. People do that today. You'll talk to them about sin in their life, and they'll blame their parents or their socioeconomic status, their upbringing, the bad influences in their life. Dad drank, so I drank. Mom was depressed, so I'm always depressed. And so it goes. But that's not new. Ezekiel, writing in chapter 18, says, what does this proverb mean that says that the fathers have eaten sour grapes and yet their children's teeth are being set on edge? There's always this person to blame, someone else to point a finger at. And certainly, sin brought suffering into the world. That's pretty easy to follow early on in the book of Genesis. The violence and the illness and the injustices and the death and the suffering that followed Adam and Eve's fall into sin and removal from fellowship from God are obvious. But notice as we continue here that Jesus sweeps aside, at least in this case, the direct link between suffering of sin and sin, a specific sin, right? There is cause and effect from sin. In a broad sense, all suffering is caused by man being out of fellowship with God and sinfulness. But in the more specific terms, if you will, here, there is not a direct link between this man's being born blind and someone's sin. In fact, in this case, in verse 3, we are told specifically, God allowed this so that he might receive glory. For the glory of God, that's what we read. On the surface, if you're thinking through this in terms of applying it to your life, it might seem like this ill fortune was patently unfair, desperately so. Why would he have to suffer and someone else would not? Yet from Jesus' perspective, this disability of being born unable to see was for God's glory and would result in this man and many other men and women's salvation, which was the glory that God was seeking. So until we see the big picture, we might very well make the conclusion that there is a specific sin that led to a specific suffering, but that isn't the case here. If you've ever read the book of Job, you know that for chapters, Job argued with his so-called friends and counselors who asserted the position that no one could suffer as badly as Job had lost 10 children in one day. How the Lord would never allow that unless you were a very horrible sinner. So what have you done, Job? And Job was willing to admit sinfulness, although, after a while his arguments with his friends almost got him to the point where he was going, I'm not a sinner at all. But you get the point. They were trying to tie the two together. And like in this story, so with Job, the Lord would say that that's not the connection that can be made. Not here, not so. This was going to be to God's glory. So this blindness was not punitive, punishment-driven, if you will, at all. This was a suffering, though, that is not arbitrary either. In other words, God had a purpose for it, to the glory of God. The Bible says, I think it's in Psalm 56, verse 8, that the Lord takes the tears of the saints and he puts them in a bottle. In other words, God doesn't waste your tears. He's very aware of them. And whatever difficulties this young man had in his life, God balanced that against the glory and the honor and the life that would be given. And he made a choice that we would never have been able to make, but he made it, and it was a good choice. And so, although all suffering is directly, or I should say indirectly related to sin in a large picture, and sometimes sicknesses are corrective, and there's plenty of Bible, I think, support for that. And sometimes they're very constructive to build you up, if you will, to bring you back. There's another category of suffering that you have to add, and that is just to the glory of God. Nothing more than God's going to use it for his glory. Years ago, when Johnny Erickson was first coming up, we had an opportunity to share a couple of times when she was speaking, and just to watch and to listen to her testimony and how she ended up in a wheelchair and how difficult life had been, and yet God was using it so amazingly so that the fruit from her life was phenomenal. Though she wasn't physically healed, she was accomplishing much more than us who could just walk around freely at our own will. Or Nick Vavujic, who was also a brother who lost his limbs. He walks with God in a way that thousands of people come to listen and be encouraged by and to see the work of God in his life. Sometimes God allows us in situations just for his glory. Now that's not an easy selling point. Like, well, maybe the Lord's just going to do something great. I don't know how much comfort that would give you if you were this man born blind, but it is important to know that from God's standpoint, And really, by the end of the story, here's another life being lived to God's glory, bringing Jesus honor. And I suspect that the years of blindness and suffering to this young man were worth it on the other side of what was about to take place. So, as they were passing by, moving from a death, or at least from a attempt on Jesus' life, they encountered this man. The disciples asked Jesus a question: is it his sin? Was it his parents' sin? Who sinned? And Jesus said, neither one, he nor his parents. Wasn't his fault. Would have been hard, since they didn't know that he was born that way. Couldn't have been, sinning in the womb, so to speak. But it also isn't his parents' fault. This isn't a direct consequence. God has a purpose in this to bring himself glory. And then Jesus said in verse 4, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, for the night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. I have to work while it is day. And I like Jesus' response, because on the one hand, the disciples wanted to talk philosophy. They wanted to kick the can down the street. Whose sin is this? And Jesus wanted to get in there and help. He wanted to go minister and to serve. The time was short. This was 6 months before the cross, roughly. I know we're early in the book of John, but time-wise, 6 months until Calvary. And so Jesus wanted to get busy. There was an urgency involved. It really kind of ties into this whole idea of salvation. Remember, these miracles were done so that you could come to the conclusion that Jesus is God and believe in him and find forgiveness for your sins. And so, salvation is kind of like that. There's an appointed time. There's an appointed day. God is at work. He wants to reach you with his love. There's an acceptable time, Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. An acceptable time, a day of salvation. Now is that acceptable time. Today, behold, today is the day of your salvation. God had a work to do with this young man today. The disciples want to talk about philosophy, and Jesus said, let's just go to him and take care of him and minister. Let's get the work done. Each one of us are kind of like this blind man in a spiritual sense. We're unable to see God. We're certainly unwilling to seek Jesus. The blind man he may have heard of him, but he certainly had never seen him, and he wasn't looking for him. He was just found by him. And yet, when we read in Ephesians chapter 4, that there's an ignorance in our heart and a blindness that living in darkness, we're not in a position to seek after the Lord. In fact, Paul said in Romans chapter 3, there isn't anyone that seeks God. There's not even one. And so that's kind of how we are spiritually. We're born blind, right? We've never been able to see. We really don't know what we're missing. But there's no way for us to put the pieces together unless the Lord comes to open our eyes and give us an insight, a taste of what he is doing. There's no way in the world we're even going to start looking for him. I don't know if you ever tried to take a hamburger away from a dog by offering him a steak, but he won't care. He's not letting go of the hamburger. He knows what he has. On the other hand, the Lord says to us, Psalm 34, verse 8, taste and see the Lord is good. Taste and see the Lord is good. And so notice that Jesus, as he passes by, there's a man who needs help. The Lord knows his heart, and I think we'll learn his heart here as we go. But here's a man that God had chosen, through whom, in his blindness, God would be glorified. And so it is God's will that all men are to be saved. You see, it was the Lord's will to open the eyes of this blind man. He wasn't looking for help. He wasn't choosing to follow Jesus. He didn't line himself up, to be in his path. The Lord was passing by. The disciples mentioned him, and the Lord knew his heart. I don't know why God chose me. I know when I was a younger believer, I thought God had made a good choice. Like, I'm going to be real helpful. And yet, the older I get, the more I wonder whether he's made a good move at all. So, it is the heart of God to restore man's sight and save them. He calls us. He lets us taste and see that the Lord is good. He'll even give this young man an opportunity to kind of obey by faith and do what he is so told, and he'll come back with a heart that is ready to surrender. So God brings us along to the point where we then have to choose whether we'll listen to him or not. Maybe you're there tonight. You've heard about the Lord plenty, but you have to now decide about him. Are you going to follow him? Are you going to trust him? Are you going to give him your life? Are you ready for him to open your eyes? That's the way the Lord works. So while I'm with you, I'm going to be the light of the world. Pretty soon Jesus would be gone and the ministry would take place through the disciples like us, through the church. And that's good. But man, there couldn't have been any clearer vision of the Lord than when he was with them. While I am here, I'll be the light of the world. And so his marvelous work certainly spoke volumes as he was with these folks. Now, we read in verse 6, when he had said these things, he just spit on the ground. He made some clay with his saliva. And he anointed the eyes of this blind man with the clay. He then said to him, now you go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which is being translated sent. And so he went and washed, and he came back seeing. Jesus' methods of healing in the Bible are certainly varied. The Lord has a lot of ways to reach us. When it came to healing, sometimes he spit and they were healed. Sometimes he spoke and they were healed. Sometimes he just touched them and they were healed. Sometimes he just commanded them to go somewhere and never got near them and they were healed. It's the spit and the speak and the touch and the command. If you started a church based on the ministries of Jesus and healing, you'd have a lot of different churches and they'd all be partially right. But you can't really box God into a method because the primary truth is always the same. His methods vary. His desire to bring life and healing to the heart, to the individual, is the same. So if whether you're praying, and you're sick physically, whether it's prayer or whether it's the laying on of the sick, maybe you go to the doctor and you get medicine, maybe the Lord just steps in and intervenes. There's a lot of ways for the Lord to heal you, but he's the one who's doing the work. We just can't box him in. But I know that there's a time and then there's an opportunity, right? There's a time when the Lord gets your attention and then it goes away. If you don't respond, it just seems to go away. Paul, when he wrote in Acts 3, said that he called folks there Peter to call folks to repentance. And then we read, so that the sins of yours might be blotted out when these times of refreshing come from the presence of the Lord. In other words, when God is working, we want to be sure that we respond to his work. And we're found to be listening. So here's a man that is ready now, right? His heart is open. The Lord ministers to him. He spits on the ground. He shoves stuff in his eyes. And he sends him down the road. And he tells him what to do. Go wash your face. Go wash your eyes. Go wash this off your face. I think this is maybe where the expression, here's mud in your eye, came from. I don't know. But this is a method that makes no sense to either one of us. If your eyes are blind and someone rubs dirt in them, now you have irritated blind eyes. I think that's about as good as it gets. But these ways of God are right. And it's obviously the way that God so often works in salvation. How in the Lord can use that? And maybe you're one who got saved in a very unusual way. The Lord used the most unlikely things to get you to the place of believing. So this was unique indeed, but it also stood out. It was the Lord's way of teaching his disciples and teaching us that his ways might be beyond our finding out, but his purposes aren't. He wants to bring life to every man. And he wants to work while the light is on because, there comes a time in our life when we're just not willing to hear it anymore. And then we're in a much more dangerous place. So, in verse 7 here, the Lord speaks what amounts to 7 words, personal, very simple, at least in English, and very direct and to the point. But they would require an obedience. So we read, go, wash in the pools of Siloam. And John tells us what that means. It means to be sent. And so this man, without question, just went and he washed. And as he was finished washing, or somewhere in that process of washing, he turned around and came back to where he was, probably to find Jesus. And Jesus was gone, but he was able now to see. A miracle had taken place. Simple words, right? Just go and wash. When Paul spoke to the Philippian jailer, he said, just believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, you shall be saved, you and your household. So very clear, simple, Jesus tells us if we call upon his name, we'll be saved. If we just call upon his name, that's all he requires. And I love verses towards the end of verse 7, the response of this blind man. It says that he went and he washed and he could see. Obedience with very little to lose at this point, I suspect, but it put him on a path of what would turn out to be true spiritual understanding. So, in a nutshell, in 7 verses, the meeting of this man on the way out of the temple area, the question of the disciples, Jesus' assertion of who he was and why he's come and what he wants to do, and then these 7 words of just direction. Go wash. Go wash your eyes. Do it in the pools of Siloam. Well, what follows then in the rest of the chapter are the reactions of everyone, beginning with friends and with neighbors. Notice in verse 8, therefore, the neighbors, those who had previously seen him, that he was blind, said, is not this he who sat and begged? Some said, well, that's him. Others says, well, it looks like him. And he finally said, no, it's me. Therefore, some said to him, how were your eyes open? And he said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and told me to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And so I went and washed, and I received my sight. And they said to him, where is he? And he said, I don't know. I mean, this kind of miracle is certainly unheard of, and it left friends and I guess neighbors, those who knew him, questioning whether this could really be him or not. How is that possible? The guy I remember can't see. Lived his life with his hand out, begging for help. But with a big smile on his face, yeah, this is me, all right. It's kind of like getting you saved, you know. You come to the Lord and all of a sudden you're unrecognizable. I got saved right out of high school. I remember going to my 10-year high school reunion. It only lasted an hour because when people found out that I'd given my life to the Lord, there wasn't much to talk about. And they didn't really want to hang around. They wanted to reminisce about the old days, but not hear about the work of God. It's amazing how you can be changed and the power of a changed life. Notice that this man, just touched by the Lord just moments before, when they said to him, what happened to you? He pretty much told them with proper focus. He told them about the process, but then he focused upon the one who sent him. His name was Jesus. He told me to go do this, and so I went and did what he told me, and now I can see. Where is he? I don't know where he is. I got back and he was gone. I have no idea what he looks like. I've never seen him. If I heard his voice, I am sure I would remember it. I just know his name was Jesus. I don't know who he is or where he is in the crowd. I can't look around to find him for you. That's about all I know. Isn't that interesting? He didn't have much to offer yet. He had a name and an experience. He had a name and a deliverance. That's all that he knew. The results were miraculous. Already a witness, faithful to what little he knew. He said to his friends and to his neighbors, here's what happened to me. Even in that place, with knowing so little, you can be a good example to what the Lord can do in your life. You know what he has done. So don't ever be discouraged thinking, gosh, if I knew more. You know enough to tell people what God has done with you. And then you can begin to build upon that. Well, with that, the neighbors, not so satisfied of what had happened, decided they would take this friend of theirs, their neighbor, to the religious leaders to find out what in the world happened here. We read in verse 13 that they brought him, who was formerly blind, now to the Pharisees. And it was a Sabbath day when Jesus had made the clay and opened his eyes, and the Pharisees also asked him again, how did you receive his sight? And he said to them, he put clay in my eyes, and I washed, and I could see. And some of them, Pharisees, said, well, this man is not from God. He wouldn't do such a thing by not keeping the Sabbath. Others said, well, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. So from friends and neighbors, we now turn to the religious leaders, the enemies of Jesus. The neighbors didn't know what to do, so they turned to the authority that they understood. Let's ask the religious leaders about religious things. And notice that the Pharisees asked him how, and they ignored kind of the obvious evidence. He can see now. He was blind. Well, how did that happen? He told them clearly the procedure again, how Jesus had spoken to them. He didn't seem to add to it. But it didn't take long for those who were in that religious group to find fault with the method. In fact, notice they said, well, that's a clear violation of Code 126.8159 of our, code about the Sabbath laws. And so this can't be a miracle. Nobody from God would break our rules. But there were other who were more rational Pharisees who wondered out loud, now wait a minute. He has been blind his whole life, and now he obviously can see. Does that really sound like the work of a wicked man? So even amongst these religious opponents of Jesus, those that lived in darkness, had no relationship with him at all, a fight broke out while the healed man is able to stand and watch, finally with 20/20 vision, the dilemma that was unfolding before him. Well, finally they ask him what he thinks. We've heard from the neighbors, the friends, we've heard from the religious. Now, verse 17, they said to this blind man again, well, what do you say about him who opened your eyes? And he says, I think he's a prophet. I think he's a prophet. The debate was solved by this man that had been touched. I think he's the anointed one. I think he's the one from God. You do realize I can see, right? You want to know what I think about him? Even under the pressure from these religious kind of bullying hardliners, this new believer, if you will, stood his ground, showed some real character, and why not? He'd been healed the hour before, he'd never seen before. He's growing by the minute and listening to the voice for the Lord, which I think he's probably scanning the crowd and not hearing him anywhere. But he's not, I'll tell you where Jesus is not. He's not found amongst these religious guys who are arguing in front of me, and he doesn't seem to be found amongst my friends and neighbors who have brought me here. So, kind of like that when you get saved. Get saved and you go tell people that you love what the Lord has done for you, and rather than opening their arms and saying, oh, thanks for helping me, you run headlong into skepticism and naysayers. You're joyful, you're thankful, you're glad that the Lord has touched you, but don't seem to be able to share that with anyone else. They're not listening. Well, that was kind of the story here. Unbelief, or just persuasions brought to the table already. This can't be a man of God. Look, the guy was blind, he can see. You don't think God did that? Well, not according to our rules. It just didn't fit the whole scenario. Well, having not been able to resolve this, we then turn in verse 18 and 19 to his parents. And we read there in verse 18, the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called for his parents, and they asked them, saying, is this your son who you say was born blind? Well, then how can he see? And his parents answered, and they said, we know that that's our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we don't know. Or who opens his eyes, we don't know. He's of age, ask him, he will speak for himself. So, from neighbors to friends to religious leaders to the fella himself, and now to his family, where the Pharisees they got to have an explanation for this blind man that can see. They certainly can't embrace the alternative. Whoever this was, this is the Messiah. This is the one that the Old Testament told us about would come and open the eyes of the blind. So they went with this. Maybe he wasn't really born blind at all. Maybe it kind of came back to him, Maybe it's a miracle in that regard. It's certainly easier to believe than the alternative. But notice that their interest was not in getting to the truth. Their interest was in discrediting the miracle and not losing their spiritual kind of oversight, giving credence to their Sabbath day arguments, their rules, regulations, their religion, rather than to the grace of God. Now, notice the parents answer very carefully. We will read here, let's read it now in verse 20. In verse 22, there was a cost involved at this point for following Jesus. It says, his parents said these things because they feared the Jews. The Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was the Christ, they would be put out of the synagogues. And that's why their parents just said, look, he's old enough. You can ask him yourself. So the parents are very conscious of the fact that their answers could cause them to suffer significantly. And they don't really know the Lord yet. To be put out of the synagogue, to be disfellowshipped, to be put out, if you will, meant that you would no longer be employed by anyone in that town. They wouldn't have any fellowship or social life with you. They wouldn't support you. Many doctors wouldn't see you. You might not get a job. You might not be treated medically. It was a big price here to pay for just simply standing with the Lord. And so they basically just said, that's our son. He's blind. We don't have any further answers than that. He's old enough to talk to him. But you get the feeling from verse 21 that they knew more than they let on. I suspect he's already told them. Because notice that they said, by what means and who? Well, nobody said either one of those things if he hadn't talked to them. But I think they knew. They were just very reticent and very kind of fearful now to speak up. The fear of man always brings a snare. Can you imagine being involved in a religion that will not allow you to celebrate with great joy the healing of your son that was born blind? The years you cared for him, the difficulty that he faced, but in fear they kind of shrink away from the frowns of the religious establishment, while standing next to them was their son who couldn't have been more happy. And I suspect that they would have liked outwardly to show their joy. So here's the fear that kind of stifles, right? Sometimes we're just, well, I don't want to come to the Lord. I don't know what my friends will think, my family will think, my job will think. Who cares? What does the Lord want? What does he think? But notice from verse 22 that it does suggest that the religious leaders had already made up their minds about Jesus. They had already made a rule in town and around the synagogue that if you confessed him as the promised Messiah, you're going to be blackballed from the society. You're no longer going to be welcome there. And so in fear, they refuse to answer any further. They admit who this boy is, that he was born blind, but they don't, I think, repeat what they'd been told by their son, who it was and the method that he was used. So then, now these Pharisees are even more frustrated. Well, what am I going to do? My life is, this life has been changed, and we haven't been a part of it, and we're supposed to explain it. We don't know what to say. So they turn back to the boy, kind of for full circle now. Verse 24, and they said again to the man who was blind, give glory, or give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. Well, he answered and he said, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, I was blind, now I see. Frustrated that they are making no progress in explaining this to the growing crowd, they go back to kind of press this blind man's life and story. Tell us the whole truth, man. We know that this Jesus is a sinner because it's the Sabbath. Nobody would do that. But his answer is pretty rock solid. You got to kind of love reading it, Whatever your conclusion about him is, whatever you come to, I cannot deny what he's done for me. You call him a sinner, that he broke the Sabbath law. I'm telling you, he opened my eyes, and I couldn't see, but I can see now. So you determine what you want about him. But I'm telling you what I know and what he's done. It's a great answer. In fact, even if you get in debate with people about the gospel, and maybe you run into people that are very astute and their words seem to work better for them than yours do for you, there's never a doubt in being able to say, this is what I was, and here's what God's made me. Here's where I was, and here's what God told me. And you can always stay with your personal relationship with the Lord and start there, because his word will never go out void. And so, simple and honest, hey, you're the smart guys. You're the Pharisees. You got the robes, and, you sit at the fancy seats, and you like people to call you rabbi and all. I'm just a simple guy, but I'll tell you what happened to me. My friend Jesus, whoever he is, wherever he is, whoever he looks like, I was blind, now I see. And they said to him in verse 26, then what did he do to you? How is it that he opened your eyes? And he said, I already told you. You're just not listening. Why do you want me to tell it to you again? Would you also like to become his disciples? Something attractive about a fiercely honest man. Not intimidated. His life had been touched. His outlook altered permanently. He stands a little taller. He answers with a touch of sarcasm. You that don't think there's sarcasm in the Bible, there's some right here. You really want to be their disciples? He knew better. But it sounds like you're asking so many questions. Maybe you want to come and follow him. So he learns fast. He takes his stand, reveals his heart, and he opens his eyes, and he opens his heart. This is what God has done for me. Well, with all of that clear evidence, the neighbors, friends, mom, dad, his testimony, under further interrogation, under further pressure, nobody had cracked. It just stayed that way, even with the parents so fearful. With the clear evidence before them, these religious charlatans finally revealed themselves. And what they do is they turn to insults, and they belittle this man while exalting themselves. It's kind of like the spiritually arrogant and the unteachable. This is kind of the Pharisees reaching a new low, if that's possible. So we read in verse 28, and then they reviled him. And they said, well, you're his disciple. We're Moses' disciple. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as far as this fellow is concerned, we don't know where he is from. The word revile is a very strong Greek word. It means to curse someone. So whatever they said, just say it wasn't very nice. And then they accused him of being a disciple of Jesus, but they wanted to make it clear they were not. We're followers of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses. We got the Bible for thousands of years ago. We have no clue where this Jesus is from, which is too bad because Moses pointed him out. The man, though, with the eyes of the Lord now sees something else. He recognizes something because he's not a dumb guy. And now he sees a bunch of people in front of him who are supposedly the spiritual leaders in the culture, unable to even answer the question, who is this Jesus? And what does he want? And so I love his answer in verse 30. The man answers and he says to him, well, this is a marvelous thing. You don't know where he's from, and yet he's opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he'll hear him. And since the beginning of the world since the world began, it has been unheard of that someone opened the eyes of them who were born blind. If this man were not from God, he could have done nothing. What a great answer. Hey, professors, scholars, Bible school graduate, you who lead the people, and yet you have no clue who this man was that has the power to open my eyes. You're the religious leaders. You're the top echelon. We look to you for these answers, and you know nothing about him. Being obviously a man of the scriptures, he quotes a few to them. He quotes and he says out of Psalm 66, we know that God doesn't hear sinners. He quotes out of Psalm 34, verse 15. It says, we know that those who worship God and do his will, he'll listen to their prayers. Now, these religious leaders apparently didn't have enough verses to stand on. They turned to cursing and to cussing and to personally, going after him, if you will, insulting him. He goes on in verse 32 and he said, look, there's no Old Testament record of someone who's been born blind and been given sight, but that was me. That's me. The Bible tells us about the Lord opening the eyes of the blind. You can read that throughout the scriptures. It sets him apart. Who's made man's mouth? Or has made him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Have an eye of the Lord. The Lord said that in Exodus chapter 4 to Moses. Isn't that me that has brought them forth? He's getting wiser by the moment, isn't he? It's almost, he's almost like making the connection. Wait a minute. I don't know this Jesus, but I think he's the one. He's the one, and he begins to lay out some scriptures and he shows himself to be a man of the scriptures who just now is meeting the Savior and the God of the scriptures. He's growing like a weed. And notice it infuriated his opposition, who are now just, they're the name callers, and he's backed away from that, and he's a Bible quoter. And so then verse 34 we read, and they said to him, you are completely born in sin. You're going to try to teach us. And they threw him out of the synagogue. They put him out. While the religious were putting him out, and we'll get to verse 35 in just a second, Jesus came back to take him in. When the religion and the religious are frustrated at the grace and the mercy of God and the need for faith, their reaction was yelling and screaming and insulting and cursing. I remember years ago, I forget who it said, but I know a lot of people have used the old phrase that if you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, the one is hit with it usually barks the loudest. Well, look at these guys barking. I mean, their fury was obvious. They were just fit to be tied. But it was hitting home. It was hitting home. I don't know if his parents went over now, stood by him and said, that's enough, this is not going to happen or not. I know Jesus stood by him. And so we read in verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? And he said, who is he, Lord, that I might believe in him? And Jesus said, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. And then he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. So Jesus now comes for this man to rescue him from a religious establishment that had set him apart, that had cast him out. The world wanted nothing to do with him. And then comes that familiar voice. He's the one. He's the one. He recognized him immediately, but he didn't know he was the Son of God. He calls him Lord. Whoever you are, you're the Lord. You've touched my life, the one who heals me. And then Jesus said, in the flesh, here I am. You can see me. I've spoken to you. You've heard me. I'm the Son of God. And he immediately in verse 38 begins to worship Jesus. And unlike Jesus almost everywhere up until the last, he allows this man's worship. He accepts his worship. 2 hours into the faith, and he's now working on a worship album. He's headed for the worship team. And God doesn't stop him. The man's heart is absolutely right. Well, we end in these verses where Jesus then says in verse 38, for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see might be made blind. Thus the spiritual analogy. And some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words, and they said, are we blind also? And Jesus said, if you were blind, you'd have no sin. But because you say we see, therefore your sin remains. And so Jesus takes this miracle and clearly defines what we need. We're spiritually blind. If we come to the realization as God begins to show himself to us that we need his help, then we can be saved. We empty ourselves of us and our ways and our plans and our efforts, and we throw ourselves on the mercy of the God who loves us and of the one that he sent, the Son of God. And by that we get life. On the other hand, like these self-righteous, wicked, angry, trying to find excuses Pharisees, who believed they could see, who believed they had answers, but look, this whole experience should have told them they'd have no idea. Even the blind man told them that. You don't even know the man who opened my eyes. How can you be the leader? But they sat on the throne of their life, and because they believed they could see, they were lost. They couldn't cry out, I'm blind, because they didn't believe that they were blind. They believed that they could see. And the minute you say that of yourself, you've kind of put yourself out from where the Lord can reach you. When in Mark chapter 2, I think Jesus was sitting at Matthew's house for dinner. Some of the tax collectors and sinners came in, and they ate with Jesus and the group of tax collectors there in Matthew's house. And outside, the scribes and the Pharisees began to mock Jesus. And they said, well, he's eating with tax collectors and sinners. And Jesus went out and spoke to them. And he said, look, if you're well, you don't need a doctor. But those who are sick need one. So I've come to call not the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. To those who realize their need, I'm available. To you, religious, proud, self-righteous people, I can't do a thing for you because you don't see a need for me in your life. And notice in verse 40 that some of the Pharisees who had been following Jesus around were absolutely sure that he was speaking about them. Are you insinuating that we're blind? And Jesus very clearly defined for them, if they were missing it, what he meant. If you're truly willing to admit that you're blind, there's life and forgiveness and mercy waiting for you. But if you insist that you see, it's going to leave you blind without hope. you won't be able to make it. Jesus in John 15, in speaking to the Pharisees and the religious, said to them, if I hadn't come and done these works, which no one else could do, then you would have no sin. But I've come and done them, so you've seen them, like opening the eyes of the blind. And it comes to the bottom line. You hate me and you hate my Father. You don't want to follow me, though you have plenty and here absolute proof of evidence. You'll read in John chapter 12 about how he did many signs for them, but they wouldn't believe them. And the Lord said, quoting Isaiah, well has Isaiah the prophet written when he wrote, Lord, who has believed our report? To whom has the Lord's hand been revealed? They could not believe because they had hardened their hearts, lest they seeing with their eyes and believing and understanding with their hearts, they would turn and be healed. But they haven't. And so the Lord said eventually they could not believe. If you turn away the Lord long enough, shut the door every time he knocks, every time you get to church, every time the Bible's open and your heart is stirred and you're still turning away, like these Pharisees, you might end up in that place where you just have nowhere to turn. And by the way, those verses there in John 12 that I mentioned to you, they end with the words of, there are plenty in the council and the Sanhedrin that believed in the Lord, but they loved the praises of men more than the praises of God. They weren't willing to just put him first and follow him. So, one story, one chapter, pretty quick. The man born blind doesn't know Jesus, but he's aware of the scriptures. He has a ready heart. When the Lord offers to touch his life, he is willing to be obedient. He doesn't know it all. He wants to follow. He does what he is told. He meets the grace of God, and he finds life. And boy, he certainly is a hero in one chapter. On the other hand, there is the religious folks, the ones that the neighbors all turn to when they don't understand something spiritual. They find themselves without a need for a Savior. They have no answer for the spiritual moving of God. They're in total denial to their own needs and their own lives, and they're headed for judgment. And we're really only in one of those two groups. We're either going to be able to say, I was blind, but now I see. Or you're going to be saying, I know stuff, I can see, without him. Good chapter, isn't it? Speaks a lot to the heart of where we stand and the grace of God that keeps us. And I hope if you don't know the Lord that you'll go down to the description box there on your screen somewhere and click on and follow the link that'll take you to a place where you can not only just pray, ask the Lord into your heart, but you can look at some Bible studies that will help you to grow, or if you like, call the church tomorrow morning, and we'll be happy to pray with you directly. All right, let's pray before we have communion tonight. Father, thank you this evening for the lesson of the man that was born blind, of this man that I don't think was looking for life that day, but you found him. And then you tell us who really is blind. It isn't the man physically blind. He was hanging on to the scriptures, looking at directions, willing to obey your word, though he didn't know you. And knowing his heart, you met him right where he was. And so there he is with life. And everyone around him wants the answers to questions, whether neighbors or friends or mom or dad or the religious leaders. It's all around him. And Lord, when man refuses him, Jesus, you came to him and secured him just like you'll do for us.